Try a quick psychological experiment with me. Imagine two different Friday nights. In the first one, you're in a crowded restaurant. Music is loud. Conversations overlap. Someone across the table is trying to finish a story while everyone else is talking at the same time. At first, it feels fun. But after about an hour, something shifts. You start thinking about going home. Now imagine a different Friday night. You're at home, comfortable clothes, maybe a movie, maybe a book, maybe absolutely nothing. And somehow, that sounds perfect. If the second scenario feels strangely satisfying, there's a good chance your brain works a little differently from most people. For a long time, society assumed people who prefer quiet nights at home were boring, or antisocial, or simply not living life enough. But psychology suggests something far more interesting. Some people aren't avoiding the world. Their brains may simply be processing more of it at once. And when that happens, quiet stops feeling boring. It starts feeling like relief. If that second Friday night sounded a little too perfect, you're definitely not the only one. A lot of people experience something similar. At first, social situations usually feel completely fine. You arrive, you talk to people, you laugh at the jokes. From the outside, everything looks normal. But after a while, something subtle starts happening. The room gets louder. More conversations begin overlapping. Someone is telling a story, someone else asks you a question. Music is playing somewhere in the background, and your brain is trying to keep track of all of it at the same time. I've noticed that people who prefer quiet environments are often still very social. They're not avoiding people, they just seem to get mentally tired a little faster. Your brain is constantly reading the room, every voice, every facial expression, every tone of voice. Most people don't consciously notice this process, but your brain is doing it constantly in the background, sorting information, interpreting emotions, deciding how to respond. One thing I've seen again and again is that some people pick up tiny social details others barely notice. A shift in someone's tone, a small change in facial expression. Those details add up, and after a while, that mental effort begins to build. Slowly, quietly, you might not even notice it at first. You just start feeling slightly drained. Not physically tired, mentally tired. So you start doing something many people secretly do during social gatherings. You look for an exit. Maybe you can check the time. Maybe you think, all right, maybe I'll head out soon. I've caught myself doing this too, not because I wasn't enjoying the conversation, but because my brain just felt full. Then something interesting happens. The moment you step outside, everything changes. The air feels calmer. Your thoughts feel clearer. Your body relaxes almost instantly. It's almost like your mind just left a busy highway and finally entered a quiet road. A lot of people describe this moment as relief, and that word comes up surprisingly often when people talk about finally getting home, but very different experiences. Which leads to an interesting question. Why do some people walk into loud, crowded places and feel energized, while others slowly feel their mental battery draining in the exact same environment? To answer that, we have to look a little deeper into how the brain actually processes stimulation. And the more I've looked into this, the more it seems like the difference isn't personality, it's how different brains handle incoming information.
So, what's actually going on here? Why can the same environment feel exciting to one person and mentally exhausting to another? For a long time, people assumed the explanation was simple. Some people are outgoing, some people are shy. But the more you look at it, the more it seems like something deeper is happening. One thing I've noticed over the years is that people who prefer quieter environments are often extremely observant. They notice details that other people seem to miss entirely. Psychologists sometimes talk about something called stimulation thresholds. In simple terms, every brain has a different level of stimulation it feels comfortable with. Some people naturally need a lot of activity around them. Noise, movement, new conversations. unexpected situations. For them, busy environments feel energizing. The activity keeps their brain engaged. Silence, on the other hand, can actually feel boring. But other people seem wired a little differently. Their brains pick up more signals from the environment. More sounds, more subtle social cues, more emotional information. I've always found it interesting that people who enjoy quieter spaces are often the same ones who notice subtle emotional shifts in conversations, a slight change in tone, a moment of tension in the room, things like that. Imagine two people walking into the same crowded restaurant. One person hears the music and sees the general atmosphere. The other person notices the music, several conversations happening nearby, a server moving quickly past the table, and the tone of voice in the conversation happening right next to them. Both people are experiencing the same place, but their brains are processing very different amounts of information. And that difference matters because every piece of information the brain processes requires mental energy. Most of the time, we don't notice this happening. It's automatic. But when stimulation keeps coming, voices, movement, social interaction, the brain has to keep working, and that effort slowly builds up. I've talked to a lot of people who say they don't feel tired right away in social settings. The exhaustion usually shows up later, after they get home. That delayed fatigue is actually a pretty common experience. During the interaction, your brain stays focused. It keeps processing information. It keeps responding to people. But eventually, the system needs a break. What fascinates me is that this doesn't mean someone dislikes people at all. Many people who feel drained in crowds actually enjoy meaningful conversations more than large group interactions. And that leads to an important realization. The issue isn't social ability, it's stimulation load. Some brains simply reach their stimulation limit sooner. And when that limit is reached, the brain naturally begins seeking recovery. Quiet, stillness, less input. The more I've observed this pattern, the more it seems like people who enjoy quieter environments aren't avoiding life. They're just protecting their mental energy. And once you start seeing it that way, the preference for staying home doesn't look strange at all. It starts to look like a very natural way for the brain to reset.
So if some people seem to reach that stimulation limit faster, what does science actually say about it? One explanation comes from something psychologists call optimal arousal theory. The idea is surprisingly simple. Every brain has a certain level of stimulation at which it functions best. Too little stimulation and the brain feels bored. Too much stimulation and the brain begins to feel overwhelmed. Most people naturally move toward environments that keep them somewhere in the middle. For some people, that middle point includes a lot of activity. Busy places, new experiences, loud social environments. Their brains feel energized by that level of stimulation. But for others, the balance point sits somewhere much quieter. Less noise, less unpredictability, less constant input. The more I've looked into this research, the more it seems like many people who enjoy staying home simply have a lower stimulation threshold. In other words, their brains reach the too much point earlier. Another factor researchers often mention is dopamine sensitivity. Dopamine is one of the brain's key chemicals involved in motivation, reward, and stimulation. For people who seek excitement and novelty, the brain may need stronger stimulation to trigger the reward response. That's why crowded events, new environments, and high-energy situations can feel exciting. But if a brain is more sensitive to stimulation, the same environment can create the opposite effect. Instead of feeling energized, the brain starts working overtime, processing conversations, filtering noise, and reading social signals. I've always found it interesting that people who prefer quieter environments often describe social gatherings in terms of mental energy. They don't say they dislike people. They say things like, "That was fun, but I need some quiet time," or "My brain just needs a break." And that actually lines up with what neuroscience suggests, because when the brain processes large amounts of information for long periods of time, it burns through mental energy surprisingly quickly. Which explains something many people notice but rarely think about, why stepping into a quiet space can feel almost instantly calming. Your brain finally has fewer signals to process, fewer sounds, fewer social cues, less incoming information. And when that happens, it's almost like the brain finally gets permission to slow down. Once you start looking at it this way, a lot of things begin to make more sense. The preference for quiet, the relief of finally being home, the feeling that social situations are enjoyable, but only up to a certain point. For many people, it's not about avoiding the world, it's about how their brain experiences the world. And that difference often comes with some interesting traits. People who prefer quieter environments are often very reflective. They tend to think deeply about conversations. They replay moments in their minds. They notice patterns in behavior. They pay attention to subtle emotional signals. I've noticed that many people who enjoy quiet environments are often the same people others describe as good listeners. They pick up on things others miss: a slight change in tone, a pause in someone's sentence, a moment when the energy in a conversation shifts. These kinds of observations require attention, and attention requires mental energy. This may explain why constant social stimulation can feel draining. But that same sensitivity can also come with strengths. People who process more information often become very thoughtful observers. They analyze situations carefully. They tend to think before reacting. They often notice emotional dynamics in a group long before anyone says them out loud. One thing that stands out to me is how many people who prefer quiet spaces are incredibly perceptive about other people's feelings. They read the room. They sense tension. They notice when someone feels uncomfortable, sometimes even before that person says anything. This doesn't mean they dislike social interaction. In fact, many people who feel drained by crowds still enjoy meaningful conversations. They simply prefer depth over noise. A long conversation with one person, a thoughtful discussion, a quiet evening with close friends. I've heard many people say they don't dislike socializing, they simply prefer smaller, calmer interactions where they can actually connect. And when you think about it that way, the preference for staying home starts to look less like avoidance and more like a different social rhythm. A rhythm that values focus over stimulation, depth over constant activity, meaningful connection over constant interaction. The more I observe this pattern, the more it seems like people who enjoy quiet environments aren't missing out on life, they're simply experiencing it in a different way. But there's an important nuance here. Because loving quiet and avoiding the world are not always the same thing. For many people, staying home is a healthy form of restoration. It's where the mind slows down, where the nervous system settles, where the constant flow of information finally stops. But psychology also makes an important distinction between solitude and isolation. Solitude is chosen. Isolation is not. Solitude feels peaceful. Isolation often feels heavy. You can actually feel the difference in your body. When solitude is healthy, time alone feels restorative. You read, you think, you enjoy simple routines. You feel calmer afterward. But isolation is different. Isolation often grows quietly. At first it looks the same. You cancel a plan. You stay home for the evening. You enjoy the quiet. But over time, something shifts. You stop looking forward to social interaction. Invitations start to feel exhausting before they even happen. The outside world begins to feel distant. Not hostile, just far away. In my opinion, the key difference is whether time alone gives you energy or slowly drains it. Healthy solitude restores you. Isolation slowly shrinks your world. And the tricky part is that the transition between the two can be subtle. Many people who love staying home still maintain meaningful relationships. They stay connected to a few close friends. They talk to family. They occasionally step outside their comfort zone. What I've noticed is that people who thrive in solitude usually still have small anchors connecting them to the outside world. Maybe it's a weekly call with a friend, a quiet walk through the neighborhood, a conversation with someone they trust. These small connections matter because humans are still social creatures. Even the most introspective personalities benefit from meaningful connections. And that balance is often where the healthiest rhythm appears. Not constant social stimulation, not total withdrawal, but a rhythm between the two. Time alone to think, time with others to reconnect. Personally, I think the healthiest version of solitude isn't about escaping the world, it's about returning to it with a clearer mind. So when you look at the psychology behind it, the love of staying home starts to make much more sense. For some people, quiet isn't emptiness, it's clarity. It's the moment when the noise of the world fades just enough for the mind to slow down. For others, constant stimulation feels exciting and energizing. But for people who prefer quieter spaces, peace often lives in the opposite direction, in slower moments, in familiar routines, in the quiet comfort of a place where nothing is demanded from them. And when you think about it, that kind of space can be surprisingly powerful. Because when the mind finally has room to breathe, something interesting often happens. Thoughts become clearer, emotions settle, ideas start forming. It's in those quiet moments that people often process their day, reflect on conversations, notice things about themselves that would normally get lost in the noise. Personally, I've always found it fascinating that the moments when we understand ourselves most often occur when everything around us falls quiet. Not when we're surrounded by distractions, but when we're simply sitting somewhere familiar, thinking, observing, letting our minds wander. And maybe that's part of the deeper lesson here. Loving quiet doesn't mean you're missing out on life. Sometimes it means you're experiencing life more slowly and reflectively, a way that values depth over constant movement, stillness over endless stimulation, and meaning over noise. In my view, people who learn to enjoy their own company often develop a kind of inner stability that many people spend years searching for. They don't always need constant activity to feel okay. They can sit with their thoughts, they can slow down, and they can find small moments of calm even when the world outside feels busy and chaotic. So if you're someone who secretly enjoys a quiet evening at home, if canceled plans sometimes feel like a small hidden gift, you might not be avoiding life. You might simply be someone whose mind thrives in quieter spaces. And maybe that's not something to fix. Maybe it's just something to understand. If this video resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Do you recharge in quiet or do you feel more alive in busy environments? And if you're interested in more psychology insights about how people think, behave, and experience the world, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more to explore.